Welcome to this episode of If I Knew Then What I Know Now, a podcast where two longtime friends, almost 20 years strong, come together to have real, honest conversations about life, growth, and the lessons we wish we had learned sooner.
With different backgrounds, male and female, black and white, we bring unique perspectives shaped by our experiences, struggles, and our personal journeys.
Today, we're doing episode number 5. We're going to be talking about boys versus girls and the scripts we were given about love and relationships. This is the podcast where we question everything we were taught, especially about relationships.
Sit back, tune in, and get to know your hosts, Dwight and Joe.
Today, we're digging into relationships.
As we start every episode, she's always digging, right? So we definitely going to have to get you a shovel.
Gold-plated.
Gold-plated.
Yep.
And with a little bling as well.
Of course. So you know me. Everything has to sparkle.
Okay. I'm on it.
All
Get
right.
you that shovel.
Nice.
So we're going to be breaking down the scripts that we were handed about love and relationships and why so many of us are out here freelance in relationships and we're using outdated instructions.
And we picked this topic because, let's face it, we've both had relationships that haven't gone the distance. And for me personally, I've gotten to a place where I've had to stop and I've had to reflect and I've had to determine what was I taught and what is actually true about what I was taught.
Right. Because I think what we figured out by now is that everything that, we were taught or learned growing up doesn't always lead to healthy relationships.
Amen to that.
All right, Joe, let's go all the way back
Okay.
to the early humans. During that time, relationships weren't about love. They were strictly about survival.
Right. Men hunted and they provided.
Yep. And women gathered and nurtured. And even though life has changed quite a bit, or a lot since that time, those roles haven't disappeared. Even modern day, right? It's still that expectation that men, provide, women, they nurture, they love, they take care of the family and that type of stuff. So those roles haven't changed a whole lot.
I don't think so. And I don't think they're bad roles either. Do you?
No, I don't think they're bad roles. But I think modern day, because so much has changed with, society and relationships now, we talked about the scripts. So I think those scripts definitely need to change modern day present in order for relationships to get to the point where, they're healthy and functioning. Yeah.
So basically, I feel like what you're saying is that we would be better off if we went back to the caveman days and we looked at relationships the way that they were meant for. However, we turn it into today's time, today's language, and we don't manipulate anything.
But the concept is, we definitely need to, we can go back to some of that. But, how do we modify that to present day to make it work?
Sounds good. Sounds like a good topic.
Let's get into it.
So we're talking what boys versus girls were taught. So the point that I'm trying to get across on mine is that, I don't feel like I was necessarily taught something. I was told, I didn't have the example. I didn't have the married parents. So all I had was a broken relationship and then a broken mother who was like, your dad's not paying child support. He's not taking you when he should take you, that sort of thing.
But I think even broader, right? Just kind of like society. I think, by the time we hit, I would say even elementary school, right? We're understanding roles, right? What boys are supposed to do and girls. And then you get into kind of middle school. You already know, whether anybody told you directly, this dude's supposed to come over and, woo me and, give me his lunch money and do all those kind of things, right? I think somehow that's all weaved in, although we're not told that directly. We kind of know that, right? We in some instances, see how the adults around us approach things. And so I don't know how that all comes out. And I agree, right? It's like not like we're taught that, but we see relationships and we see how they go. And then we hear like, mom or dad, family saying, well, this is how things should be.
Right.
So,
But let's look at your example of the the child, the boy who, is expected to approach and that sort of thing. What if he approaches a insecure, wounded, confused young girl?
mhm,
Like, how is that gonna go? Right? He is not gonna have the same type of receptiveness from her, because of her insecurities, because of her fear, because of, all of those things. So, I feel like that was me growing up.
mhm.
Was I was scared, I was insecure, and then I was kinda taught to not trust men.
Right, right. So that's how that all plays out, right?
Mhm.
Because of that insecurity and the things that you were taught, that allowed you to even pull back even more, right? So, again, boy approaching, well, I'm reading, how this girl is that I like. So now that means I've got to come forward even more because, my instincts tell me I like her, right? But that just feeds into how relationships evolve, right? If we as men don't press and push forward, then the relationships more times than not don't happen, right? Because you all are more, hey, don't be easy, don't put yourself out there. There's a stigma, or was one, with if you're too forward as a woman, how that's going to be interpreted as being easy and available and those type things. So that's all kind of, baked into the cake, right?
There's that, but then there's also the masculine and the feminine, right? So, I don't wanna be too masculine and, like, go after some person that I'm interested in because I want to be feminine. If I have to initiate and start to lead, then I'm going to continue to have to initiate and lead in a relationship, and I don't want that.
Not necessarily, because what you all were taught, right, are those choosing signals, right? So you can be extremely feminine
Mhm.
and use those choosing signals, a smile, a look, all those little subtle things that we're expected to pick up on.
Mhm.
And those are things that we weren't taught, right? I never had a conversation with any male in my orbit, family, whatever, that says, hey, here are choosing signals that girls will give you. You need to be able to pick up on these to know that, she's interested, those kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So you miss all that, right? And then, but then, if, we're at recess and the girl smiles at you, you're like, oh shit, yeah, she smiled at me. That means something, right? But we were never taught that. So it's a really great conversation, but to wrap that up in terms of like what boys were taught versus what girls were taught,
Mhm.
we all know, right? We were taught to be strong. You don't cry. You supposed to provide. You're supposed to pursue. We were supposed to be like superhero, Batman. But we didn't get the support system to
Knight
be
in
able to
shining
do that.
armor.
Yeah, the knight in shining armor. That's it. And, again, girls, women, hey, be nurturing, be attractive, maintain the relationship, don't be too forward, be Wonder Woman, but, be emotionally responsible for everybody else around you.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, some of us maybe weren't actually taught anything at all. They didn't have role models or weren't necessarily taught, um, you know, um, when I was growing up, I just heard because I came from a broken home, the negative things about men and the negative things about relationships and oh, men only want one thing, so be careful. So I grew up scared, confused, I did. I did.
Yeah.
I wanted, like, I think we all naturally want partnership. I think
Yeah.
that's just something that everybody just wants.
Mhm.
It's it, it's an instinct, right? Just like all mammals, they have instincts, right? Um, but I was scared and confused, and I had absolutely no way um to know how to maneuver that.
Right. It's real interesting, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit later. And you talked about like instincts and what's kind of naturally ingrained like within us, right? You used this big fancy word earlier called procreate. I'm gonna say that again, procreate, right? But if that's naturally ingrained, then why or how did it get so far away from us just knowing that that's what's ingrained and I guess to the point where, that's almost become a bad thing, right? In modern day, if that's what we were originally designed for, to come together, to, kind of be that family unit or that there's this partnership and the whole purpose of that if you even go back to biblical times to be able to have those relationships and produce and grow and multiply. When did that become a bad thing? That's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question. One I also don't know the answer to.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask you the question,
Mhm.
and maybe even like anybody watching this, as it relates to relationships, especially like early on in relationships, who do you think has the harder time, men or women?
Um, I'm gonna say both, and we touched on it. I think in our conversations, men have that financial, be the provider, take care of kind of, responsibility, and then women having the emotional piece of it,
Mm.
right? And then if you come from any type of a background with any struggles, then your um, faith in your abilities to do that is going to be impacted.
I hear that, but I want to go back to let's go back to middle school, right?
Okay.
To young Joe,
Oh
right?
my goodness.
Who again however life has been up to that point, struggles,
Mhm.
insecure, all those things, right? And let's go back to young Dwight in middle school. Dwight's interested in Joe. How does that move forward?
Um, Dwight approaches Joe. Dwight may not know to approach Joe unless Joe smiles at him or laughs at his jokes or flips her hair at him, whatever,
All right.
right?
All right. So in that instance, right, and we fast forward to modern day, I feel like it's always the guy that has the harder time, right? Because if the rules are, or the script is that we have to initiate, then we feel that rejection. We have to be strategic in how we make that approach.
Mhm.
So just that fear of having to be the one to initiate, I think makes it incredibly hard.
I can give you that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can. I remember having conversations with some friends of mine about like, you know, where they were married and financially, like they were the breadwinners
Mhm.
and their wives didn't work. And I was just like, I've never experienced that. I've never had it where I wasn't working and somebody was taking care of me financially. I
Mhm.
was always contributed. And sometimes most of the time, I think I've been the one that made more
More. Mhm.
money. And so it just it's like blows my mind. I, I don't, I've never experienced that. And so I've experienced having to be the breadwinner and a single mom and to take care of everything. And I know the pressures of it. And
Mhm.
so I can relate to males from that perspective of that pressure
Right.
for the financial side of it.
Right. So you have all that, right? But then you also have, the piece of, does she like me? How do I get her to like me, right?
Yes.
How strategic do I have to be? And as we're talking about all these things, right? We taught or learn, well, the way you do that is, you perform, right? You gotta, be funny. You have to have something of value. You have to be able to do something that separates you from everybody else to be able to get to that next step of, hey, can I sit at your table at recess or something weird like that, right? So I think it's always harder for the men, even present day, right? Because women, the teaching, whether it's been direct, indirect, kind of assumed is you're supposed to come to us, and then we sit back and we evaluate and determine, like, that whole are you worthy thing. All right, so we've hit on a lot of really interesting topics today, dynamics, in terms of men and women and relationships. And I really love the fact that, we can have this conversation because I think it's really healthy, right? To have that, opposing perspective. I think the things that we've talked about today, most men and women think about, have dealt with, but to be able to have that raw conversation with someone and for it to be real, I think is super valuable. So I'm really happy that we're able to do this. But I want to switch gears, right?
Okay.
As we've been talking about relationships and boys and girls. So there's this whole thing, right? Masculine versus feminine energy, right?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit
Yeah, we
earlier.
talked a little about that. So that's one of the topics that's been debated quite a bit recently, right?
Mhm.
You see it all over social media. But originally, right, it wasn't about gender, men, women. What it was about was, I think, is having that balance, right?
Mhm.
We all, I mean, there's a part of me, right, as a man that, can be vulnerable, where that's typically associated with, women. There's also a part of women, i.e., you talked about, how you always had to provide, right?
Yep.
That's typically that masculine, thing. So I think the key is having that balance, and that's what it was really all about. Masculine being about energy, structure, direction, logic, right? Opposite side of that, feminine is about, hey, that flow, that intuition, that emotion. But where I think we've gotten off track quite a bit is, we've turned that whole balance into almost some hard roles, right? As a man, you gotta have this, right? And you can't have too much of that or any of that in some cases. And, vice versa with women as well. What's your thoughts on that?
I feel like a good relationship needs to have masculine and feminine, that positive and that negative in order for it to work. But you can't have two people trying to be masculine or two people in their feminine energy,
Right.
right?
This is going to lead perfectly into our next segment. I like where you're going with this.
Yeah.
You talked about growing up, right?
Yeah.
Where, the way you grew up was all about having to take care of things, take care of yourself.
Yep.
And again, definition that is that masculine energy. So talk a little bit about that, right? And in life, how have you managed to kind of weave that masculine into the feminine, and how where are you at with that present day?
So yeah, like, my childhood, I was forced to survive.
Mhm.
And so I had to quickly, get into that masculine energy and start taking care of myself, start making things happen, start pursuing things and start providing things that parents should have provided. And then as a young woman, trying to maneuver that, wanting to be feminine, and then going back, you're looking, biblically too, or caveman or whatever. Like the way that it's supposed to be. That instinct is still there, but you, it's hard to not start to take the lead. And I think that I have attracted feminine energy men in my past. I've attracted masculine men as well, and then we quickly clashed, and it doesn't work. But it doesn't work for me. A feminine man doesn't work for me either. Feminine energy, I should say. I don't want to be the breadwinner. I don't want to be the one that holds it all together. I don't want to be what I see as the traditional male role. So for me, where I'm at today to answer that question is I just pay attention to the energy that I'm putting out there, and I try to bring my feminine energy and control that, let certain things go that, like, I could fix it. No, let's let that person fix it. I as having adult children as well, like that's a good practice on feminine energy, because both of my kids, I've got a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, my youngest, and then my oldest, married and has a family of her own. When they say something, sometimes I'm like, just, don't say anything. Just that they're adults now. Just let it go. Like you don't have to get in there and fix it and be super mom. But here's what I think you should do. Or, there's certain things you still need to provide your input on, but if it's not that big of a deal, let it go. And so having adult kids has given me the ability to practice that. And so I need to approach that similarly in relationships going forward, because I do want a masculine man. I don't.
Okay. So, but you said that, in the past that, that when you've had that, right, there's been that, I guess, let's call it friction, right?
Right, because
or the flow hasn't been right.
Because
So,
I didn't let go of my masculine energy.
so how do you do that, right? And this leads us into the next thing I want to talk about, right? I've heard so many women, internet, all that, saying they want a man that puts them in their feminine energy. I want to get your thoughts on that after we talk about kind of how do you do that, right? Because it's important. So how do you not slip into, you're in a relationship, how do you not slip into that masculine? How do you manage that?
I think it's about working on yourself and understanding those parts of yourself. I don't think that someone can put you in that energy. I think you have to bring it.
Right.
And I think that you have to take some time and do some soul searching. And I, I think that when people say it, they're saying, I want to feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But you shouldn't look at somebody else for anything that you need to provide to yourself first.
Right.
I need to provide my safety first.
Right.
My inner child needs to know that I'm safe that I've dealt with the
Mhm.
things that make me insecure.
Mhm.
I can't go into a relationship expecting.
So let me tell you what I think men hear, right?
Mhm.
When we hear women saying, "I want a man that's gonna put me in my feminine energy," right? What I think most men would agree is what we hear is, "Oh my God, this is one more thing that I now have to do,
Mm.
and to be judged on whether or not I can do this thing,"
Am
right?
I doing it?
I feel like, as you said, no man should have to put a woman in her feminine energy. She
Mhm.
should bring that,
Yep.
but I can definitely create that environment in that relationship where you feel safe and comfortable enough to relax, to let your guard down and be that. But I don't want to have to work to put you there, right? Because that's just one more thing that, from a male perspective, well, what if I don't? Then, what if I can't? Then does that mean I'm being judged by this person that, I can't put them somewhere they should already be?
And in my opinion, if you have to work for that, then you're dealing with an unhealed person.
I agree like 10,000%,
Yep.
right? Um,
That's a red flag.
well, later when we talk about like our non-negotiables,
Yeah.
I have
Okay.
two specific, but I think they cover everything. So let me ask you a question that I think is funny, right?
Okay.
Tell me what you would think, right? Or you're with a bunch of your girlfriends, coworkers, some of them that may even know me, and you hear me say, "Hey, I need my woman to put me in my masculine energy." What would you think if I was saying that as a man?
Uh, that you were a f- in your feminine energy.
Right, right,
It would be a complete turn off to me.
right. Absolutely. And if you contrast that with us as men, when we hear women say that,
Yep.
it's a turnoff.
It's gonna be a turn off. Yeah.
It's a turnoff, because that's telling me, right, you're not comfortable with who you are,
Right. Exactly.
and you're relying on someone else to put you in a state that you're unable to get to yourself.
Yep.
So if that's that dynamic, then that's someone that I know is not healed, someone that I know I really don't want to deal with, right? Because men, we don't get a pass, right? We don't get to show up, after a hard day and go home and say, "Hey, babe, I really need you to put me in my masculine energy," right? You're like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think in a long-term relationship though, there will be times where you could come home and say, I can't be myself 100%, right? Like you can say that. You can say that you're
Are
unable.
those the guys that were in their feminine energy?
No, no,
Are you
no.
sure? Because no, I couldn't say
You
that.
couldn't say that.
I don't know any men that I know that will be able to come home and say that.
I mean, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that relationships are partnerships and that it's okay for one person to be off
Right.
and to let their partner know that they're off and that they're just they're they're off. Like you and I were talking earlier, you were talking about your week, right?
Mhm.
I'm sure that the day that all of that stuff went down, you were off that day. And if you would have had a partner you came home to, you would have been like, I can't be 100%.
Um, so here's where I think we get into like, what you expect of your partner, right?
Yeah.
So the next one that I do have, if I come home and that's the dynamic, rough, whatever, I express that, you know what I want? I'm not gonna be like, hey, I need you to put me in my masculine.
No.
I want the question to be, hey, what do you need from me?
What do you need from me? Yep.
Yeah.
What do you need from me? What can I do to help?
Yeah.
This is a partnership.
So, that's the dynamic, right? But to be able to be like, put me in my masculine, that's insane. I don't know any men that's going to say that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know many men that are going to want to take on the challenge of, trying to put a woman there. It's, being able to read those dynamics and what do you need? And, you both create those environments where you feel like, I'm in a good place. My needs are being met and all that. Okay. So we've talked a whole lot about like relationships and, boys and girls and men and women and some of the things that, we took from, our early ancestors all the way up to now. Talked about, that male and female energy, all those things. And even that statement about being put in your feminine or masculine. So there's another one I want to talk about that I've heard a lot, right?
Okay.
That during my marriage, I absolutely fell into, right?
Okay.
But I know that I never really agreed with it, right? And that one is this term, happy wife, happy life, right? So I want to talk about that because you hear that so much. And as I said, I fell right into that.
Yeah.
But I also have some very strong feelings about the whole dynamic that sets up. So let's talk about that from your perspective as a woman, right?
Okay.
And then mine as a man. So what's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I understand the intent of it. However, I think it creates an imbalance in the relationship. No one person should be responsible for carrying the whole thing, everybody's happiness. You need to come to the relationship already solid, already whole.
But let's talk about us, right? We know in like all our relationships, we didn't show up solid and
I
whole.
was divorced. It's 2011.
Right. As whole. But in your marriage, right?
Mhm.
Did you ever, I guess, reap the benefits of that where, it was someone that was trying to make sure that, that statement was met?
Um, so I think our dynamic was a lot different than your dynamic. He may have presented it that way, like a narcissist typically does, acting like, oh, I just, dote over her and I just, da 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 da. So appearance wise, that may have been
But that wasn't something you were feeling like in that. And
no. What I'm just saying, then, like behind closed doors, it wasn't. It, it wasn't, fulfilled. So it was put out there to give everyone the perception of that. But in reality, it wasn't.
right. So and talking about men, right? You were saying he was put out there that way. And I talked about how I fell into that. And I'll give you an example, right? I go back and look, or I could have, right, at one time, all the money I spent on purses, right?
In your feminine energy, right? No, just tease.
Well, yeah, right. Because, if all I'm doing is trying to buy the next shiny thing to please you,
Yeah.
because, it's about happy wife, happy life. And if I want the latest, greatest, new purse that's 700,000, 800,000 or more, right?
Yeah, I couldn't imagine.
Right. And then all I see is them stacking up on the shelves, right? So happy wife, happy life, that's what I want. I expect you to give me that, right? If you're not giving me that, then again, am I being judged on fulfilling my role as a man, right? So those are the type things that I think we fall into as men, right? That yeah, we want to please and provide and those kind of things. And there's all these expectations, whether they are spoken, unspoken. But then those type things, that dynamic automatically puts you in that role of more feminine energy because what am I here for? I am here to make sure you're good. Everything is good for you. Your life is happy. Well, guess what happens in that process?
Right.
And I will raise my hand and say, this happened to me, right? Lost. You know, what about me? What about happy life, happy husband? I wonder what the opposite of that would be, right? Um, for men.
Yep.
So in that whole transition, that dynamic, you get lost. Um, in some cases, your feelings don't matter. Um, so you're just kind of putting everything into everyone else, and no one's really pouring back into you. So as we've talked about healthy relationships and dynamics, right? I think that's one that we definitely need to take off the books and say, that's a no-go
I
because it
agree.
automatically sets up that dynamic of, feeding everything into one person and nothing into the other.
I agree with that. And, one of my absolute favorite verses in the Bible is, love is patient, love is kind. Love is not self seeking, right? And what you described, happy wife, happy life, that was self seeking, on one individual's part. Love is a partnership. Love is, patient. It's kind. So that's one of my absolute favorite. I think I'm gonna get that tattooed, on my add that to my sleeve here.
And you know what? Looking back, I can pinpoint times where that dynamic really irritated me, right?
Hmm.
Because there would be times where my ex would be out at the mall shopping, mom or whoever, right? And she would say, oh, I saw this thing, blah, blah, blah. And I thought about getting it for you. And I could just feel like, what do you mean you thought about it, right?
Right.
Now, why are you coming and telling me what you thought about, right? What am I supposed to do with that, right?
Hmm.
You thought about it? Well, what stopped you from doing that, right?
Hmm.
And then I go into the closet, to get my slippers and I look up at all the purses and say, well, gee, I didn't think about getting all those, right? I got them, but,
Yeah.
so those kind of little dynamics, resentment, right?
Yeah, for sure, 1000%.
Resentment. And over time, you just carry those, it builds up. And then it's kind of like, yeah, well, this is really off.
Absolutely. I mean, no one person should have to carry the entire relationship and concede to what another person wants.
Uh-huh. So the title of this podcast, right, is If I Knew Then What I Know Now, right?
Yeah.
But when we were in that, we didn't know these things. We've said many, many times, we're just trying to figure it out. Going forward, I think it's a really good place to be, right? To know, well, this dynamic is not going to work, right?
For sure.
This dynamic is not going to work. Going out dating, right? Going to be a whole new thing, but if the expectation is that I'm gonna approach you, I'm gonna pursue you, and I'm gonna take you out and do all that kind of stuff, why? No, for me going forward, it's gonna have to be a mutual reciprocal thing, right?
I
Like,
agree.
we've had these
1000%.
conversations about what we each want, we go out, if we're not even aligned to get to that point, then no, I'm not gonna be, spending resources just to fit this script that we've been given over many, many years that
Mhm.
I think no longer serves us. And I think we're seeing a lot of men today start to push back on that a little bit.
Right.
You seen all the different clips on the internet where, guy takes a woman to the Cheesecake Factory and, well, that's not good enough, and then she's gonna humiliate him, berate him and all that for going to the Cheesecake Factory, right? Well, what? I don't even really know you, right?
Yep.
So, but yet you come with this expectation that you deserve this. I think there's got to be a lot of pushback on all those scripts that we were handed,
Agree.
and how do they really apply modern day, right? And
Definitely.
in doing that, not that women are bad or men are bad, it's that, we need to figure out that whole where do we meet in this whole thing and how do we figure it out based on what we both want, where it's not one-sided and one person's forgotten or there's these expectations of one and, that kind of stuff,
Yep. I agree with that.
So, well, good. I'm glad we agree on that. So we're both at this real interesting point in our lives right now, trying to figure out and navigate what's next, specifically in terms of relationships. So let's talk about, from your perspective, what's next for you, I'll do the same in terms of kind of what I see is next in terms of relationships and that way forward. So.
Oh, so this is like build a partner, right? Career,
Yeah.
personality, looks, add to cart.
Yeah. This is where we can kind of, go in and say, I'm gonna check that one. That's good, not so good. Yeah. So let's build them.
Okay.
So, we know obviously relationships need to be built on respect, shared values, and all of those things, right? Not just on the chemistry or the attraction. So, what are your non-negotiables, when you get ready to fill up that cart? What is it for you?
I think we talked about that one earlier. One of my non-negotiables is if somebody is showing me that they're more feminine energy, it's no, I'm not gonna put up with that. I'm not going to um even if I see any hint of it whatsoever,
Mm-hmm.
and if I recognize any type of unhealed stuff, um, I, I am, I need somebody to come at me healed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't need to be the fixer because I think in the past I've made that mistake where I'd be like, oh well, I can. No, I need somebody to come at me healed as much as possible. I,
They can still be working on it, right? Okay.
absolutely. Okay. Awareness of what you are working on
Right.
is okay, but like completely oblivious to it. But like I can see it. That's a absolute red flag.
Now, you and I, we've known each other for a while, right? You used to have like, most of the girlies, you had your list, right?
I
So
did.
where is that at now?
It's not as important. I s- I want more of a connection. I want somebody who has the same values as me. I want somebody who has a strong faith. Um, a friendship is significantly important to me when it comes to
Why are you looking at
relationships.
me when you're like describing this person? Just look in the camera.
Big head over there. Goodness gracious. What am I going to do with you?
Yeah. See, I'm always gonna get my revenge. Anyway, go ahead.
So, you know, just and somebody who naturally like I'm drawn to, and I feel safe. I'm not saying you got to, make me feel safe.
Mhm.
I need to sense that.
Mhm.
I mean, I told you before, I feel energy is like huge,
Mhm.
huge, and I pay attention to energy of people, and that's in everything. That's in work. That's in people I deal with. Energy,
Yeah.
and then I adjust from there based off of how much I give. What about you?
So I wrap mine up in two, and you already hit on these, right? So my two are number one, I don't want my next relationship to be with anybody that's undisciplined, right?
Yeah.
And when I say undisciplined, I mean that covers a whole lot of things, right? So I'll just use the whole physical piece, right? You can go to the gym 7 days a week and work out, but if you're undisciplined in terms of being able to like manage your diet and where you still look like all the work you're doing there, those two things match up.
Hmm.
No go from me. So undisciplined is one, and the other one is unhealed. You already talked about that. So I put everything in those two categories, right? Um, height, looks, age, all those things, right? Don't make the list. My main things, are you a disciplined person,
Hmm.
and are you healed? And again, you can be on that journey of healing and growing, right? Because we all should be, growing and wanting to get better. But if you're not doing those two things, it's a no-go, right? If you're not, in those two, if it doesn't fit in those two categories and you're not doing those things, then it's definitely a no-go, right? Undisciplined, I talked about, the gym piece of it, right? If you're struggling with finances and, your whole thing is you want somebody to, shore that up for you, that's an undisciplined kind of thing, right?
Yep.
You're showing up and, our initial conversation about, expectations in a relationship, and you blurt out, oh, I want somebody that completes me. And, you know, I'm not going to complete you. You're already complete, right?
Yep.
You just not completely healed. So, I'm not going to be, or I want you to be my everything. No, I don't want to be your everything.
That's
I
a
want to
bad place
be
to be.
everything for me, right?
Yeah.
I want us to complement each other. So, those are my two things, right? If you're undisciplined and unhealed, because I know for me over the past, I'm gonna say 3+ years, like all the mental work, all the reading and the understanding and processing, I will never like just
You don't want to waste.
easily give
Yeah.
that away
Yep.
to someone who hasn't started that or at least doing that, right? Because
Agreed.
in my mind, that's just a drag, right? So
Yep.
those are my two, and everything kind of filters into those. So yeah, I don't want something that has to feel super intense right away. That, oh my God, I gotta have this. Not anymore.
Yeah.
Not
I think that
anymore.
scares a lot of people though, right? Like if it's like peaceful and it's calm and it's easygoing and whatever, they're like, well, this is boring. And it's because it's what they had before was unhealthy
Yeah.
and they don't realize it. And so they,
And I hate to harp back on the internet a lot, but you see so much, right? Especially with divorces,
Mhm.
and we know women kind of lead that charge in terms of, divorce. And a lot of times you ask them why. Well, I was bored, right?
Yeah.
So but that goes back to, this person is supposed to make me happy, right?
Yeah.
If you're not happy already with who you are, then, that's just one more thing that gets dumped on this other person to make you something, right? Um, and I can see why, so many relationships fail now.
Absolutely.
For most of human history, relationships were about survival.
Today, they're about connection.
But you know what? We're still dealing with each other.
Like we're trying to survive.
Hey, as we wrap this up, we want you to remember something. Wisdom is not about getting everything right. It's about learning, choosing better, and having the courage to overcome the things that might be holding you back. This podcast, which is If I Knew Then What I Know Now, something that hopefully can help you do that. We're going to ask you to do this. Take what fits, leave the rest. Don't forget to smash that like button, hit that subscribe bell so we can bring you more content like this in the future. We'll talk again real soon.